Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Before we begin, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me. It really does help. You can also join my Patreon. We are in the midst of a fundraiser there for a very important cause. I will talk about that at the end of the video. I'm not sure if they do this anymore, but when I was a teenager, eons ago, it was very common for girls to be asked to appear in local fashion shows. Even in my small rural Utah town, there was always a yearly bridal festival, and I'd often be asked to model that year's new wedding dress as part of the show with other girls in my ward, in my Mormon ward. The other girls and I really had no idea what we were doing. We didn't have any training, but we were always excited to be asked. You'd show up at the show and they'd put you in the clothes and you'd walk the little runway. Sometimes the shows were at the mall, which was especially exciting because that was out of town for us, so you'd get to travel. And like I said, I don't know if they do this anymore. Part of me hopes they don't, which is sad because I want kids to have that fun experience. But doing what I do now, I know there is no question that every time they have one of those free fashion shows at the mall or the shopping center, there is at least one guy there that isn't the least bit interested in the clothes or the event. There is always at least one guy there because he is a predator and he's getting enjoyment out of the young girls modeling. Yikes. He might even be picking out his next victim. Today we are talking about just such a man who I believe falls into the category of born bad. This is the story of serial killer Christopher Wilder, the Snapshot killer. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Christopher Wilder is born in Sydney, New South Wales. His father was an American named Coley Chapman Wilder, who was a naval officer stationed in Australia. Christopher's mother was an Australian woman named June Wilder. When Christopher was born, there were complications and he nearly died as a newborn. Then, when he was 2 years old, he nearly drowned in a swimming pool. Or so the story goes. As Christopher got older, there were instances that you could view as normal boy behavior, or you could view them in hindsight as warnings. That's part of what is so fascinating with these crime stories. So many times we see common behavior in boys that's actually not great, but we pass it off as boys will be boys because it's common. Only later on, some of those boys do not become men. They become monsters. In January of 1963, when Christopher was only 17 years old, he was at a swimming hole the kids would spend time at in his area. It was a popular place for kids to go in the warm weather. Christopher was there with two of his friends. He somehow talked a 13-year-old girl over to where he and his friends had set up their little day camp. He then violently attacked this girl and her while the other boys looked on and did nothing. The girl reported the assault and Christopher was taken to the police station, then to trial, and he was sentenced to probation. Probation for this vile act. So already, right out of the gate, we've got a kid that is showing signs of violent and deviant behavior. He gets in trouble with the law and nothing is done about it. Christopher would later say that as part of his probation, he was sent to a therapist that performed electroshock therapy on him, and that made him worse. Who knows, some of those archaic methods were used and they were awful, and I guess that's something we will just never know. The real issue is that a journalist who dug into Christopher's life later on says not only is there zero evidence that Christopher ever underwent electroshock therapy, there's actually zero evidence that the story of him almost drowning at the age of 2 happened. This journalist is a man named Duncan McNabb, and he spoke with family members of Christopher's, and they told him the entire story of the near-death drowning was a lie. Christopher Wilder goes on to graduate from high school, and then he takes a series of odd jobs. It's also said that he does a lot of womanizing from his senior year in high school through his early 20s. And again, that's something you could say about a lot of men. In 1968, at age 23, Christopher got married, but only a week After the wedding, his wife left him. Why? Christopher had been acting very strangely. Then the cops showed up at the newlyweds' house and took Christopher to the station for questioning on a series of sexual assaults that took place at Manly Beach. After the police took Christopher into custody, his wife contacted a family friend who was a police officer and said, "Hey, I've got some things I need to talk to you about." The first revelation was that Christopher had tried to kill this woman twice. His ex-wife said Christopher wasn't really a wife beater. There were just these two instances where he kind of zoned out and then tried to choke her to death. Look, ladies, I know it's not always easy to leave, and I shouldn't even say ladies. We know that there are men that are abused too. But why are you going to give someone a second chance to try and kill you, you know? Once someone gets violent with you, the chances of it happening again are astronomical. Behavior very rarely changes. Once someone gets violent in a relationship, it's going to happen again. You deserve better than that. You are too good for that kind of bullshit. I know it's hard to leave, believe me. I've been there, not with my ex-husband. He was a decent man, but I had a boyfriend. I get it. You love this person, you're in a relationship, but they're not going to change. Then Christopher's soon-to-be ex-wife tells the police that she once found some photographs of young women in their underwear hidden inside a briefcase in Christopher's car. R.I.P. to any man who was with any sort of awakened woman, because I just think it's astonishing that there aren't more Lorena Bobbitt cases. I'm not saying I want that to happen. But women, we aren't like we were 20, 30, 40 years ago. We ain't putting up with the shit we used to. A few months later, in 1969, a student nurse contacted the police to inform them that Christopher Wilder was trying to extort sex from her in exchange for nude photographs he had taken of her. The police pressed charges, but the woman was too embarrassed to testify, and so the charges had to be dropped. Christopher Wilder had developed a reputation in his area, and things weren't going so great for him. He decided to pick up and move, not just cities, but countries. And that's when he came to the United States. In late 1969, Christopher emigrated to America and rented a very posh waterfront home in Boynton Beach, which is about 25 miles away from Palm Beach, Florida. While there, he obtained his real estate license, and very quickly, he was making very good money. It's common for sociopaths and psychopaths to be really good at sales. They're very good at telling people what they want to hear, and they're good at convincing people. Some of you, I'm sure, are already aware of this, but there are a lot of big corporate CEOs who are psychopaths. There are even companies that do psychological testing and prefer to promote psychopaths in their company because they are so out of touch and emotionless, so cutthroat, yet they maintain the ability to be charming when they need to be. It's quite terrifying. Christopher might have changed countries, but he did not change behaviors. Between 1971 and 1975, he was arrested over and over for different charges of sexual misconduct. You see, Christopher had picked up a new hobby during his time in the States: photography. Just like Rodney Alcala, William Bradford, Harvey Glattman, there are several, Christopher Wilder learned that by taking up photography and promising girls modeling contracts, he had easy access to women. As we've discussed in similar cases, Christopher would approach young women and tell them that they're beautiful, hype them up, tell them they should be a model, and then, oh, by the way, I should know because I'm a professional photographer. This was a big ploy in the 70s and 80s. You have to remember, most people didn't even own a camera. And if they did, it was just like a little one to take family photos. So when some guy approaches a young woman with this big, complicated looking camera, there was kind of some instant credibility there. He must be a professional. Why else would he have a camera like that? Now, everyone has a camera in their hand at all times, and a lot of people have nice cameras. They know a lot about photography, but it wasn't like that back then. Christopher would talk these girls into coming somewhere with him alone, and then he would attack. In 1971, he raped a young woman that he managed to lure into his truck by promising her a modeling contract. This young woman went to the police. Christopher was convicted of her rape, but got no time. I feel sometimes like my head's going to explode. I really do. Whenever I hear people talking about how feminism isn't needed anymore and women are equal, Those people are idiots. They don't know anything, especially about history. If you take a 5-minute gander into the 1980s and find out what the conviction rates were for rapists, that should be all you need to see. It was not a good time to try and make a case against a man for sexual crimes. It's still difficult to make a case. And you know what makes it even worse? Women who lie about assaults. Don't get me started on those women. Not only do they ruin men's lives, but they utterly destroy the process actual victims have made in being believed. Not only is Christopher Wilder convicted once, he is convicted several times of sexual crimes, and not once does he get actual time. Not one single time. So we've got a repeat offender, a chronic offender. He's got a rap sheet dating back to the age of 17. All of his crimes are violent sexual attacks. They're all similar in nature. And by age 30, this guy hasn't spent a single night in jail. It is spectacularly shocking. I often think about the cops back then that would arrest guys like Christopher. What happened when they would hear that they got no time after they went to trial? Like, don't you think that made even the cops angry? If you don't, you need a higher opinion of cops, because I think that would have been really frustrating. I know there were plenty of issues with cops back then, and I know there still are plenty of issues with cops, but I think sometimes we underestimate them. After one of his many arrests for sexual misconduct, Christopher is sent to a court-ordered psychiatrist in 1977. After evaluation, this doctor deems that Christopher is a mentally disordered sex offender who is, quote, not safe except in a structured environment and should be in a residential program. Okay, so what happened? That did it, right? He was immediately ordered into a program like that for treatment? Of course that's not what happened. The psychiatrist even went on to say, Christopher has a need to dominate women and turn them into slaves for his pleasure. They're just women, guys. Nothing to see here. Just a violent predator who should be locked away and studied, turned loose on the streets. Hey, it's a Tuesday in the justice system in the 70s. No big deal. Christopher was bold enough to tell the psychiatrist that he was very interested in white slavery and that he enjoyed... I can't go into a lot of detail here, but it involves causing pain in a very specific manner. After this last run-in with the law, Christopher decided it was time to go home to Australia for a visit. So he flies home in 1982, and he isn't there for more than a couple of weeks when two 15-year-old girls contact the police and inform them that Christopher had kind of accosted them at Manly Beach and aggressively talked them into letting him take pictures of them with their clothes off. Christopher gets these two girls alone and they're taking some photos, and before long he's demanding that they remove their clothes. So these girls go to the cops and the cops find the photos and Christopher is arrested. His parents posted bail for him because of course they did. I'm sorry, but if I've got a kid that's been in this much trouble repeating this same sick offense over and over, sorry, love ya, jail. Sit in jail. The police actually allow Christopher to fly back to the States and await a hearing on the matter, which is something I find to be ridiculous. And that's when things go from bad to much, much worse. There's a race taking place at the Miami Grand Prix. Back then, at a lot of events like this, there would be booths for vendors to sell their wares. And it was common to hire women as spokesmodels to sell things at these booths. You know, the pretty girl holding up the product on the rotating giant Lazy Susan. Rosario Teresa Gonzalez was one of those women. She had been hired for the day to work as a spokesmodel, passing out free samples of aspirin for a pharmaceutical company. Teresa was dressed very nicely in red shorts and beige heels, wearing a t-shirt with the company logo on it. People at the event noticed a white balding man kind of hanging around the booth. And then at noon, they saw this man leave with Rosario, and she was never seen again. To this very day, we do not know what happened to Rosario. Her 1980 blue Oldsmobile Cutlass was later found near DuPont Plaza. Just a coincidence, I'm sure. Christopher Wilder had taken up race car driving and was often seen around the racetrack. Police know he was at the race on the day Rosario disappeared because he raced his Porsche 911 in the IMSA GTU class. There was never enough evidence to tie Christopher to Rosario's disappearance, but if you ask anyone who knows this case well, Christopher killed her. Just weeks later, on March 5th, 1984, Elizabeth Ann Kenyon went missing. She was 23 years old at the time, and she had been a finalist in the Miss Florida pageant. She had also dated Christopher Wilder. Christopher had actually proposed to Elizabeth, but she denied him. The last time Elizabeth was seen, she was with Christopher at a gas station near Miami. 6 days later, her car was found abandoned at the Miami airport. Now, here's a very telling fact. Rosario and Elizabeth had both participated in the Miss Florida pageant. They knew each other, and the people that knew them knew they knew each other, and they told the police. Just like Rosario, Elizabeth has never been seen again. Neither body has ever been found, but again, police are convinced Christopher killed both women. I want to show you a photo. It makes my stomach turn. At the beginning of this episode, I spoke about these local fashion shows that were very common in the area. Well, someone captured this image. This is a photo of a young woman on a stage, and Christopher Wilder is in the background ogling her. First off, whoever set this up is gross. These skirts are way too short to be on an elevated stage above the audience. That's really taking advantage of the models. Models can wear as skimpy a clothing article as they want. It doesn't mean they're agreeing to be put in a position where someone is able to see what they might not want to be seen. But just look at this weasel. Knowing what he is, knowing what he goes on to do, it makes me feel sick. And we're going to talk about this fashion show in a minute. Days after Elizabeth disappeared, on March 18th, it happened again. 21-year-old Teresa Ann Ferguson was shopping at the Merritt Square Mall in Merritt Island, Florida. A man approached her and began smooth-talking her, telling her she was so beautiful and that she needed to be a model. Teresa was not falling for it. She'd heard this before, of course, from guys, and she just kept walking. But the man was insistent. No one knows the details of what happened after the last time they saw this man harassing Teresa. All we know is that Christopher murdered her and dumped her body at Canaveral Groves, where it was discovered 5 days later. Christopher is now in a frenzy. He has most likely killed the two women who have never been found, and now he has killed Teresa. 2 days after that murder, he strikes again. On March 20th, Christopher walked up to 19-year-old Linda Grover, who was a student at Florida State University. She was shopping at the Governor's Square Mall in Tallahassee. Linda was a happy girl who was walking along with her Walkman, listening, ironically, to Down Under by the Australian band Men at Work. She had a longtime boyfriend whose name was Eddie, and she was looking to buy a photo album to put all of their photos in. Christopher went up to Linda and did his little song and dance, but Linda wasn't having it. Christopher was unsuccessful in persuading Teresa. He approached her twice, but each time she said, "No, my boyfriend wouldn't like this. Plus, I'm a surfer and I don't shave my legs." Christopher said, "Well, you can't win them all," and he walked away. But he was far from finished. He followed Linda to her car and pretended he was parked next to her in the mall parking lot. He said, "Let me just show you the magazine that I shoot for." Linda was annoyed, but she was trying to be polite, so she leaned towards the car, and then Christopher punched her in the stomach. The pain was terrible, and she doubled over. Then he grabbed her and took her down into the back seat. He tied her hands together and wrapped her in a blanket and then put her in the trunk of his car. He then drove to the Glen Oaks Motel, where he somehow managed to get her inside, and there he raped her. Christopher then superglued her eyes shut, using a blow dryer to dry the glue. Christopher then used some copper wires to shock Linda. She fought with everything she had, and she managed to get into the bathroom in the motel room. She began banging on the door and pounding on the walls. Christopher couldn't get into the bathroom, and he knew that Linda was making a lot of noise. So he ran to his car and he fled the scene, taking all of Linda's belongings with him. Linda Grover had just survived a serial killer. 23-year-old Terry Diane Graham Walden is walking on the campus of Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. She's a mom, she's got 2 little girls, and she's going to school to become a nurse. She goes home that evening and tells her husband that day an older man had approached her and asked her if she'd ever thought about being a model. Terry told him no. The man asked her to come to his car to see some samples of his work. Terry very firmly told the man absolutely not, and then told him to leave her alone. 2 days later, she vanished. A friend saw her around 11:30 on the morning of the 25th, going to her orange Mercury Cougar. By 5 o'clock that evening, when she hadn't returned home, her family was frantic. They set up search groups and called the police. And then the next morning, a road worker found Terry floating face down in a canal near the college. She had been tied up with rope and she had been gagged before being stabbed. 40 cops were assigned to the murder. The FBI came in. People were unsure why this huge response. That's because they were unaware that Linda had just escaped a serial killer whose description matched that of the man seen talking with Terry. The cops knew this had to be Christopher Wilder, and they were right. They found Christopher's abandoned Chrysler the next day. He'd taken the plates off and replaced them with stolen plates. They thought he had probably switched them out with Terry's plates and was most likely driving her car. Investigators knew they had to find this man and find him quickly, but they weren't fast enough. On the same day that Terry vanished, 21-year-old Suzanne Logan disappeared from an Oklahoma shopping mall. When she failed to pick her husband up from work, he reported her missing. Just an hour later, Suzanne was found by a fisherman near a reservoir. Her body was under a cedar tree, and it was still warm. Suzanne had been tortured, and she had been raped before being stabbed to death. Christopher had shaved her pubic hair and cut her long blonde hair off. The cops then traced Christopher back to a motel where they found Suzanne's hair in a trash can in the room they'd been in. Now, I don't know why this is, but sadly, Suzanne was not identified for 10 days. Her family would later say that the police didn't do right by her, that they hadn't even worked her case very hard. Christopher knew the police were close by. He'd heard the chatter in the coffee shops, and he'd seen some of the headlines that let him know they were onto him. So he ran again. By March 29th, Christopher was in Grand Junction, Colorado. He picked up 18-year-old Cheryl Lynn Bonaventura, and they were seen eating together at a diner in Silverton, Colorado. They told the waitress that they were headed to Las Vegas after they stopped in Durango. The two then traveled for a couple of days together, and they were even seen at the Four Corners Monument. They drove right through my little corner of the world here in southern Utah, and then they went on to Page, Arizona, which is not, by the way, how you get to Las Vegas. They checked into the Page Boy Motel, and from there, they took a day trip near the Kanab River. So this is someone that Christopher just picked up. Probably a hitchhiker, maybe a sex worker. Kanab is about 55 to 60 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. There on the banks of that river, Christopher shot and stabbed Cheryl Lynn to death on March 31st. Her body wasn't found for a little over a month. The next day, the very next day, you guys, Christopher was in Las Vegas alone, walking around at the Meadows Mall. Oh, that just gives me the creeps, because that's the mall I took my kids to school shopping every year to get their school clothes when they were in school. They're adults now, but I mean, it's a ghost town now. The Meadows Mall isn't still a thing, but back in the 90s and early 2000s, even into the 80s, I guess it was the place to be in Vegas. So it makes sense that that's somewhere that he would go. That day, there was a 17 magazine cover model competition being held in the mall. And this is the event where the creepy photo was taken. This is where we see Christopher sitting and ogling the girls on stage. Really, really, really vile. So he approaches this girl named Michelle, who is part of the fashion show. The details on how he approached Michelle aren't as clear, but we know that Christopher killed her and dumped her at a Southern California rest stop. Her body wasn't found for 11 days, and it wasn't identified until weeks after that, and they had to use her dental records. 2 days later, on April 4th, 16-year-old Tina Marie Rizzico was approached by Christopher, and she allowed him to take some photos of her. After the photos, Christopher attacked Tina and drove her to El Centro, California, where he raped her. There was something about Tina that was different for Christopher, and he saw in her not only a victim, but an accomplice. He kept her alive, and he started telling her he wanted her to help him abduct other girls. Together, Christopher and Tina traveled through Prescott, Arizona, Joplin, Missouri, and even into Chicago. As they traveled these states, all within a matter of days, the FBI added Christopher Wilder to its top 10 list, and his face was plastered everywhere. Every news station announced that a new fugitive had been added to the infamous top 10, and everyone knew what Christopher looked like. So he was starting to feel the pressure. By April 10th, Christopher and Tina Marie had made their way to Maryville, Indiana. Christopher used Tina Marie to persuade 16-year-old Donna Sue Wilt into getting into the car with them. As soon as Dawnette was in the car, Christopher attacked her, and Tina Marie drove. While Tina Marie's driving, Christopher is in the back seat, being Dawnette over and over. Tina continued to drive until the trio was in New York. There, Christopher dragged Dawnette into the woods where he attempted to suffocate her. He then stabbed her twice and, thinking she was dead, left her in the woods. But Dawnette was not dead. She took her jeans and tied them tightly around her chest where she had been stabbed. She then limped through the woods and onto the road where she flagged down a truck driver. That man, named Charlie Larson, took her to Soldiers and Sailors Hospital in Penn Yan. For some reason, Christopher got nervous and he turned around and went back to the site where he had left Dawnette. I think he wasn't sure she was dead. Well, of course, she wasn't there. The next day, it was all over the news. Dawnette had survived and she was talking. She told the police and the press that Christopher Wilder, the serial killer on a killing spree, was heading towards Canada. Christopher and Tina Marie continued to drive. They stopped in Victor, New York, parked the car, and went inside Eastview Mall. There, Christopher taught Tina Marie how he picked out and stalked his victims. They followed 33-year-old Beth Elaine Dodge to her car, and Christopher pulled a gun on her and drove the two of them out of the parking lot, with Tina Marie following in Beth's Pontiac Firebird. So at this point, Tina Marie is in a different vehicle and she's still participating. I know there's some Stockholm Syndrome going on here, but we'd need another episode to talk about this. Why didn't she run? Christopher then pulled over, shot Beth, and dumped her in a gravel pit. Just senseless murder for the sake of murder at this point. Christopher and Tina Marie then both got into Beth's Firebird and they drove to Logan Airport in Boston. Christopher bought Tina Marie a plane ticket to Los Angeles, and then he headed north into Beverly, Massachusetts. There he pulled a gun on another woman, but she was able to flee and got away. It's a literal madman on the loose. A day later, Christopher has made his way to Colebrook, New Hampshire. He stopped at a Vic's Getty service station and asked directions to the Canadian border. Well, there were 2 New Hampshire state troopers at that gas station, and they were well aware of the murder spree that this serial killer had been on. They were pretty sure this was the guy, so they approached Christopher and asked him to identify himself. Christopher ran to his car, opened the driver's side door, and jumped inside. He leaned over to grab his Colt Python .357 Magnum. Trooper Leo Jellison was able to grab Christopher by the arm, but not before Christopher got to his gun. During the fight, 2 shots were fired. The first bullet hit Christopher in the upper chest and exited through his back, lodging in Jellison's chest. The second bullet hit Christopher squarely in the chest. He relaxed, he slumped over in the car, and he died. Some reports called it a suicide. Some reports called it an accidental shooting. Only the 3 men there know what really happened. With Christopher dead, the investigation ramped up into high gear, and what police found is absolutely horrific. It appears that Christopher Wilder began murdering women clear back in 1965. In January of that year, 2 15-year-olds, Mary Ann Schmidt and Christine Sherrick, were killed on Wanda Beach in Australia near Sydney. Police combed the beach and found many clues, but they could never find the killer until he himself was dead. Now, we are out of time for today, but the deaths of 12 additional women have been tied to Christopher Wilder. Wilhelmina Kruger, Anna Dowling-Koa, Tammy Jo Alexander, Mary Oppitz, Mary Elizabeth Hare, Tina Marie Beebe, an unidentified woman in Palm Beach, Sherry Lynn Ball, Tammy Lynn Leppert, Lori Jane Kiersey, Melody Marie Gay, and Colleen Emily Osborne are all thought to be victims of the Snapshot killer. Police continue to work on those cases as we speak, and you know I will update you if there is ever any closure on any of those stories. Christopher Wilder wouldn't have such an easy time of it in today's society. The days of a man walking up to a woman telling her he wants to take a photo are long gone, but that doesn't mean the predators are. They aren't in the malls anymore. They're on the computer. They're hiding in dating apps and in chat rooms. They're using their charm and their wit to talk girls into meeting them in parks and restaurants. They're convincing young girls to climb out their bedroom windows at night and run away with them. As you are well aware, I often get frustrated at people who want to blame the internet or the music or the video games or the technology we use to communicate as the cause of why bad things happen. Those people are not well studied. because if they knew anything about history, especially the history of crime, they would know the manner of communication has nothing to do with violence. A bad man will always find a way to be a bad man. A predator will always find his prey. Long before we had the internet, there were shopping malls. Before that, there were boarding houses. And before that, there were girls' schools. It's time we stop with the misguided anger and the performative cries about the manner in which victims are taken and redirect that anger and our energy at the people doing the taking. Until we focus on the person, on the psychology, and stop blaming the wrong things for violence, we're doomed. As of right now, we're all just waiting to find out who the next monster is. Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. You can also join my Patreon, which keeps the videos coming. We're in the midst of a fundraiser. This is the thumbnail. It will tell you all the information you need to know. We're raising money to donate to police departments who have cold case DNA in storage that's never been tested because there's no money. We're raising money to help with that cause. I want you to know how much I appreciate you. You've stayed with me through this slow time rebranding the channel, and it's almost spring. I hope you're well. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.